could figure out who's infrastructure and who's the customer.
I'm Alicia Robb. I'm a senior research fellow at the Kauffman Foundation, and I'm an angel investor with the Unreasonable Institute in Boulder, and I live in Marin County.
Oh, great. How'd you get hooked up with these guys?
We get around.
Great.
I'm Chatsky, managing partner together in Boulder at East Labs Startup Accelerator in Kyiv, Ukraine.
Okay.
So I've been in Ukraine already for 5 years, but originally I'm from Brazil.
From Brazil?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great combination, Brazil and Ukraine. That's probably worth at least a day's worth of stories. Welcome.
I'm from Estonia, based here. Sort of dark side, representing the government.
Huh? Estonia, the government's good side there.
Hi, I'm Magda from Poland. I'm from Hardcover Ventures, and I run Canaris Accelerator in Poland.
Hi, Wayne Sutton, entrepreneur, currently working on platform in the CRM space, and angel training, currently participating in Ask It, angel investor program, and also with the Pipeline Fellowship angel program as well. So,
Okay.
it's both worlds.
Right here.
Hi, Monique Robinson. I'm co-founder of Startup Monthly and also an entrepreneur.
Emma Theodore, coordinator.
I'm Olga Bilkova. I'm managing East Labs with Evelyn, and I'm also a newly elected member of Parliament in Ukraine.
Oh, really? Oh, congratulations. Oh, and you're not from Brazil. I can tell.
Jesse Martinez, tech entrepreneur, Latino Startup Alliance, and Spark America.
Vadim Slavin from Startup Monthly. I think everybody knows me.
Yeah.
Alina Elek, I'm originally from Russia. I've been living in Silicon Valley the last 12 years. CPA by profession, but recently got into this whole startup world and invested in goodwill and joined the team. So here I am.
Dan Mark, enterprise software startup guy, also in the Ask the Angel training program.
Lily Sherman, small angel investor, do consulting for B2B enterprise software folks. Very small and very big.
Yeah. We know you.
I'm Dmitry Ufayev. I'm venture capital management partner of venture capital firm from Russia. We are based on the largest private university in Russia.
Great. Great. And does any of you know who I am or why you're here? It was a nice drive. So just so you're sure, I'm Steve Blank. I find this very funny because my previous career was just as an entrepreneur. I just kept doing it until I got it right, is the way I kind of describe it. I was a serial entrepreneur. I did 8 startups in 21 years. Because I couldn't focus on any one thing, I actually did a series of very different industries. My career started in military intelligence, both in the military and as a startup in Silicon Valley. My first boss became the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Bill Perry. And then I did the first of 2 semiconductor companies, one called Zilog, then called MIPS. I did some consumer Macintosh hardware in the late 80s. I did a video game company, then I did a supercomputer company, then I did an enterprise software company. And the final score at the end was 4 IPOs and 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. I mean, they were just very large failures. In fact, the next to last startup, I lost $35 million of investor money. My parents were immigrants from Russia. And I called up my mother, who was still alive at the time, and told her, "Mom, I've lost $35 million. And luckily, English still was not her first language, because she said, "Well, where'd you put it?" And I said, no, I spent it. And she said, "Oh, we can't change your name, it's already blank. There's no place to go back, and the village is gone." And I said, no, I just want to, I'm calling you now because the same people just gave me another $12 million. And she did Russian, and this time she broke into Russian and Polish and Yiddish, and she said, only in America are the streets paved with gold. And in fact, that is the kind of the story here, because I took that $12 million, and for you VCs, you ought to hold down, sit down, because you are, because I returned $1 billion each to the two investors who gave me the $12 million. And so that is, in fact, the story of Silicon Valley, which is, you know what we call a failed entrepreneur here? There's a special word in the Valley. Anybody know what the word is? Experienced. It's a big idea, because part of this culture is you have multiple shots at the goal if you're an entrepreneur. If you failed honestly, if you didn't cheat or lie, and if your first words out of your mouth are not how to blame everybody else, but instead is, boy, let me tell you what I learned. You know, I'll never do that again. Then all of a sudden, our culture and also our commercial bankruptcy system allows you to shut down a company in a matter of weeks, you know, kind of say goodbye to the people you owe money to, and then start again. Now, of course, if you do that enough times, you don't get enough shots at the goal, but you would at least get, you know, one or two more. And I was lucky to have done that. And I was also very lucky. It happened to be in the internet bubble, and I decided to retire and watch my kids grow up. And I also decided to do another piece of Silicon Valley culture. Have you all heard about the pay it forward culture? Anybody know about this? Well, you're seeing part of it. So pay it forward was just, you kind of owe a social debt to the people who helped you when you were young. It's now your turn to give back, and there's no requirement to do that. It's just, it's what you saw people who were in positions of power when you were young. In fact, the most famous photograph is a very young Steve Jobs, before he did Apple, with hair down to his shoulders, sitting with the head of Intel, who he found in the phone book. And head of Intel kind of thought this kid was crazy but interesting, and became his mentor for 15 years without particularly asking for anything. And the Valley is full of those stories. So I decided to give back by teaching. And so I had no idea what I was going to teach, but you know, most retired executives tell war stories. You know, let me tell you how it was when I was, you know, an entrepreneur or whatever. But I decided that I was going to write my memoirs, that the world really needed to hear my history. And so I remember typing my memoirs, and I still have them, because I got to page 78 and realized something I had never realized in 21 years of being an entrepreneur. And the thing I realized was there seemed to be a pattern of success and failure, not only about my startups, but about, this time I had been sitting on boards of public companies, of private companies, advisory boards. I was realizing the same success and failure pattern for me seemed to be occurring for every other startup I knew, and that was, you know, there really was a repeatable pattern for reducing failure that no one seemed to be articulating. So I went down and talked to my friends on Sand Hill Road, and the best of them, you know, Don Valentine, Bill Davidow, and Brooke Byers at Kleiner, all kind of said, well, of course there is, Steve. And I went, of course there is. How come you guys don't write it down or teach it? And they went, well, that's not our business. Our business is picking winners and coaching them, not, you know, educating them. And I just thought that was a big mistake. And here's what I learned, and here's what I've been teaching for the last decade. The mistake we've been making as investors and as entrepreneurs is that we've treated startups like smaller versions of large companies. It's a big idea. We have said that everything a large company does, a startup should do. And we've taken that position as investors, and we've taught that to our entrepreneurs. What do I mean by that? Well, large companies write business plans for their next version of the product. We make startups write business plans. Never once kind of understanding, though we knew it, that no business plan survives first contact with customers, right? I mean, we write the plan, but we kind of as investors know, yeah, but you know, after 18 months, there's no similarity between what they wrote and what they're doing. But we made them write that anyway, and in fact, even more so, we always used to make them write Appendix A. Anybody remember what Appendix A? What's the appendix in a? It's income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. In fact, it's the 5-year plan. Now, no one else, particularly in the United States, ever noticed that who are the only other people other than venture capitalists to require 5-year plans? is that, you know, the Soviet Union was the only other place with 5-year plans, and we know how well that turned out. And the same thing was, and I don't mean this as a joke, is we were requiring entrepreneurs to forecast 5 years into the future, and we were happy if it said $100 million in year 5, and you know, we invested, or we at least paid attention, never quite understanding that that was also, except for small corner cases, also a joke. The other thing we made startups do is we said large companies, they're organized in sales, marketing, biz dev, engineering. We want you to organize that way from day one. Where's your head of sales? Where's your head of marketing? That is, we said, that functional organization, that's what you need. Without ever understanding, here's the clear distinction. Large companies execute known business models. That's why they're large companies. They have found something repeatable. They have figured out by the time they get big, we do more of this, or hire more of these people, or hire more salespeople, here's their quota. It's repeatable. But not understanding that what startups are doing and what investors are looking for is startups are searching for repeatable and scalable business model. This distinction between search and execution is not just a set of words. We kind of, if we watch startups, and we have for the last 50 years, we know the CEOs are different, right? We know the teams are different. We know what they do on a day-to-day basis is different, but we never had a theoretical framework to kind of explain and to help startups to kind of figure out what to do. Because once I had that insight, the next question is, so what? So what is it that you tell startups to do that's different from large companies? And herein comes my contribution. Because the first thing I decided to teach and write about was something called the customer development process. That it seemed that the biggest part of the startup failure rate was the founder's vision and passion, and their investors' encouragement said, great, it's a great idea, wonderful, now go hire and build it. I'll give you some money. Well, that seems kind of natural. What else could go wrong? Well, what else could go wrong is, on day one, a startup vision and passion driven by the founder is actually a faith-based enterprise. It's a religious activity. On day one, there are no facts involved. You're betting on the founder's maybe experience, his vision of the market, but what you quickly want to do is turn that faith into facts. Because the problem and the mistake that always happened is you took the founder's passion, who said, I know what problem to solve, and they immediately went into product development and built the product. Right, so that was, I mean, we did this, you know, repeat for 40 or 50 years. In fact, there's still investors in other places of the world who think that's the model. We now kind of understand that the largest part of the failure rate was actually making those assumptions that we actually know what customers want. I mean, the biggest failure is not from product development. It's a huge idea. Even here in Silicon Valley, most startups don't fail from a lack of technology. They fail from a lack of customers and revenue. And we have all these methodologies to kind of improve product development. We had no methodologies to improve customer development. And so the first thing I came up with is kind of a phrase that said there's no facts inside your building, so get the heck outside. And developed a process called the customer development process, which basically forces founders to take their initial assumptions and say all they are is hypotheses. And I use the word hypotheses now because I teach at Stanford. Those students pay 50 grand a year, and their parents want to hear that they're learning something expensive. But outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses, what's the regular English word for hypotheses? Guess. They're just guess. Assumptions is still, that's a $25,000 word. Guess is a word that the man on the street would understand. Oh, right, and now I understand. A startup is a series of untested guesses. Whoa, it's a big idea, right? So number one is you want a process to have entrepreneurs to rapidly test their guesses. The other thing that happened over the couple of years is we were looking for a framework to kind of collect these guesses. And about 4 years ago, someone named Alexander Osterwalder came out with a book called The Business Model Generation. Have you all seen it? If not, you should all download the first 72 pages and buy them, and make all your startups buy them. Because the business model canvas is a way to collect all the hypotheses, rather than a business plan, we can now say, listen, a startup, it just has 9 things you need to worry about, at least core things. You need to worry about value proposition, that is what product or service, who you're building it for, what customer segment, what's the revenue stream, that is revenue model and pricing tactics, how are you going to get, keep, and grow customers, what's the channel, who are partners, resources, activities, and costs. Somebody mind saying hello to those people? Thank you. Once we have the canvas, what we've now done is actually gave us a map for startups to write down all their hypotheses. And now the customer development process works with that canvas by simply saying, glad you wrote them all down, glad you have them, but now I have a process to get out of the building and test every one of those hypotheses. And in that process of testing, here's the amazing thing, is I will find out that I'm wrong for most, if not all, of my initial hypotheses. And guess what? We now know something else very new. We now know that in reality, startups don't go from success to success. They actually go from failure to failure. And the ones that survive are the ones that learn quickly. They either change their hypotheses in small ways, pricing should be $1,000 rather than $200, or they change radically. Pricing shouldn't be a direct sale at all. It should be licensing or subscription or freemium model. That's called a pivot. So now we have a way to describe how we learn. We learn by iterating and pivoting our hypotheses. The other piece we discovered is building our product with all the features on day one is, again, another exercise in faith, but really isn't particularly productive, because in the last 10 years, we now know how to build products and engineer them iteratively and incrementally. And so we use some type of agile development methodology to, instead of building every possible feature, build the minimum feature set and go out and test that as you're talking to customers. Now, if you put all these pieces together, some really interesting things happens. One is we now have a definition of what a startup is, which was, when I was an entrepreneur, I couldn't have told you. Steve's definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. So now we know what an entrepreneur should be doing. Why they think they should be coding or selling or whatever? Not really. They should be searching. What should they be searching for? All those components of the business model. And they should be looking for something that's repeatable and scalable. And by the way, the components of the business model that matter most, well, it's who were your customers and what was the value proposition, and those 2 things are called product market fit. And so when you're searching through all those 9 boxes, the things you pay attention to first is, am I building something that anybody else wants? And then I could go down and at what price and what channel and how do I acquire and activate them, etc. The other thing we now know is that the 3 things I just described, business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, is now the entrepreneurial API, or a common language worldwide. If you get your entrepreneurs speaking Canvas, customer development, and agile engineering, you now have a common set of questions and a common way to communicate with them, and also a baseline of how to evaluate them. Is, really, nice idea, draw your canvas for me. Really, nice canvas. How have you tested the hypothesis? Why didn't you do that yet? Great, we love you guys, great team, come back when you've actually done some customer development. And now we can have conversations that allow us to enrich, the conversation that we're having with early entrepreneurs. And of course, as investors, once you set up a set of heuristics or rules, you'll break them all the time by saying, I don't care about that. This is a great team, we're funding these guys. Or this is they've invented anti-gravity. I don't care about their canvas, but it at least gives you a way to start talking to them and them talking to each other about progress. Because what we now know for sure, is that across a portfolio, using this kind of methodology, whether it's mine or someone else's, it doesn't matter. We now know how to make startups fail less across a portfolio. I can't tell you which one will succeed more, but I can tell you, this is now kind of like just moving the whole ocean up by another foot. This will reduce risk across a portfolio, not because we're making them smarter. But we're reducing what's an NP-complete problem that is a computationally unsolvable problem to something that's bounded by giving them a framework, right? We're just giving them a way to avoid the 100 stupid things that entrepreneurs do on day one, not because they're dumb, but because there was no roadmap before. So that's my 2 cents. The other observation I would make is this stack I talked about, business model design is Osterwalder, customer development mine, agile engineering, 1 million people, XP, Scrum, etc. One of my best students, someone named Eric Rees, put all that stuff together when he was sitting actually there. I sat on his board, I funded his company. Eric was the first guy to ever do customer development and agile engineering together. And there's a book called The Lean Startup, and Eric kind of gave it a phrase called the Lean Movement. And it's catching on worldwide. So let's see, that's about all I'm going to say, except a couple things. I teach a class at Stanford and at Berkeley and at Caltech and at Columbia called the Lean Launchpad. It takes all this stuff together and teaches engineers mostly, so though some of the classes are taught in business schools, on how to use these principles to start a company. Now, the class was also adopted by, in the US, something called the National Science Foundation, which is the group that funds all science and engineering research except for medical in universities, as the standard class for commercializing all research technology in the US. We'll teach 300 teams this year, another 500 next year. It's taught at, besides Stanford and Berkeley, University of Michigan, Georgia Tech, and then another 10 universities next year. I put this class online for free on udacity.com, so if any of your entrepreneurs want to see what this stuff looks like. And then I realized, while I put the lectures online, it doesn't have the in-person coaching and mentoring. So I partnered with a nonprofit called Startup Weekend. Have any of you ran into Startup Weekend? It's a nonprofit. It puts on a 54-hour program of how to start a company, but a lot of people who went through that were really kind of excited and said, well, what do we do next? And they went, next, good idea. So now they're offering a 3-week class called Startup Weekend Next that uses my online lectures with thousands of volunteers across the world to host these classes. And we ran the first 5 as a prototype. We're doing 25 cities in November, December. We'll probably do 300 to 400 cities worldwide next year. And our goal is to create 10,000 startups over the lifetime of this program. And we'll see if it works. So you should just know all that's free. It's available to your ecosystem. For those of you investors, I would suggest if there aren't free resources in your city or region, get people into that program, both Startup Weekend and Startup Weekend Next. Think of it as a uranium enrichment facility. I mean, it's taking low-grade feedstock in and hopefully making weapons-grade material. Though that's probably a bad analogy, particularly if we have some unsecured nukes somewhere. So that's what I've been doing, but I'm happy to answer any question. I probably missed some.
So I think Monique's got some questions.
Right.
I've got some questions. I'm going to get started, but really want to give the attendees a chance to ask their questions. Let me just kind of get rolling with one thing. You know, recently I was reading a blog post from Paul Graham, and he was reflecting on, you know, all of the startups that he's funded, and realizing that the most successful have been completely unpredictable, and there were some of the ones that most folks thought wouldn't go anywhere. And an example, a case in point, is Airbnb. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I have a equal list of laughing at some of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard, which turned into Apple and Tandem and about 5 or 6 other startups in my career. I'll answer that with a very funny story. So when I used to teach how to write a business plan class, and in fact it was in the middle of that when I realized this is stupid. Our students aren't getting smarter. In fact, it's kind of worse. And when I started hating business plan competitions, because they actually don't do anything for the students. But the way we used to select teams was who had the best idea, and we'd admit them into the class based on the best idea. And so when I started my Lean Launchpad class, we'd select students and teams for exactly that, who had the best idea. And then the second time I'm teaching this, I go, wait a minute. We know the best idea doesn't end up as the best idea, and the worst idea sometimes ends up the best idea. So why are we doing this selection? What is it we know? And it's very funny because I teach all my classes with experienced Silicon Valley VCs, from Moore Davidow and from Floodgate and from True Ventures and from a bunch of other firms. And we started laughing because, you know, VCs in the Valley, while the idea is part of it, you're always looking at the team. And so now when I interview for our class, because it's admission by interview by team, we look at the team first. It's number one, is I don't care what idea you have. And in fact, at times we've actually done this, though I will deny, even though it's on video, that this is true. We'll sometimes turn down a great team to see what they do. And almost every time, they'll literally stop us in the parking lot and like pin us to the car before, you gotta let us into the class. And we giggle because we know this is what great teams do, and bad teams go, oh yeah, I could take the accounting class as well. And wonderful teams like go, no, this is the most important thing for my career. And so, yes, we look for, background, experience, but, I tend to select now, and I'm not an investor. I don't know, you guys who do this professionally, I'm just in awe. I might write a check every once in a while, but it's out of stupidity or sympathy rather than strategy. But I tend to notice, much like VCs have known for 40 or 50 years, that an A+ team with a B idea will always kick the butt of, an A+ idea and a bunch of losers. It happens all the time. I was a great example of that. I thought I was a pretty aggressive and rapacious, in hindsight, entrepreneur. I don't think I ever had an A+ idea, but boy, I could certainly steal someone's A+ idea. I mean, you want to see the world's best story of that? Go watch the movie Social Network and watch Zuckerberg. It wasn't that those twins who had the idea were dumber. They were just thought that God was supposed to give them, and it was all about ideas. In entrepreneurship, maybe in life sciences it's all about the ideas, but certainly for startups that have customer and market risk, it's all about the entrepreneur's aggressiveness and the combination of the opportunity and timing and, are they surfing in a tidal wave or are they surfing in a flat wave? Does that answer your question? But I'm not as good as Paul and certainly not as good as the rest of you in picking ideas. I tend to now just pick aggressive, curious teams who are not afraid to change. And when you watch them in this class, here's what's interesting about this process in the class that if you're investors, you should think about. Because I remember when I first put together a class, I invited a bunch of venture capitalists in to teach with me. The students would present on day one, and instead of presenting a business plan, they were presenting a business model canvas. And the VCs looked at me and said, Steve, it's just another way to kind of describe your business plan. What's the big deal? I said, wait. Because every week, students had to get out of the classroom and talk to 10 to 15 customers a week. And then come back in the next week, present again in front of their peers, and update their canvas. And so they come in the second week, and the VCs are kind of looking, going, well, that's different. That business has changed since that. Really? And I'm just sitting there smiling, but they're not quite saying. Now the third week happens. They've now talked to another 20 or 30 customers. Right now, they come back in the third week, and usually it doesn't take any VC more than the third week. Because what happens is they're now presenting, and at about team 4, the fourth presentation of the day, almost like clockwork, the VCs will turn their head, look at me, and say, we've been doing this wrong for the last couple of decades, haven't we? And I go, your choice. Because what you now see is the teams you would have thrown out of your office or never had back because great team, stupid idea. You gave them a process, and in 3 weeks, they've now iterated into something that actually is worth now a conversation. But we never had a process before to see, in fact, their progress over time. Because now what I suggest to entrepreneurs is never show up with an idea unless you think somebody's going to write you a check on the idea. What you want to show up with is, here was my original stupid idea, and let me tell you what I've learned in the last N months. Here's what I've done, here's who I've talked to, here's how my canvas has evolved. Make it short, but at least let investors know that every good idea they were going to tell you about how come you haven't done X or Y, not only have you done all that stuff, boy, here's what customers have told you. You still might have a terrible idea or something not funded, but now the conversation is really interesting of, you learned what? Who'd you talk to? You know, what do they say? How many people do you have? Now all of a sudden, I think we could raise the bar for what investors start looking at, because now the conversations get kind of interesting. Gee, is this monetizable? Can it scale, etc.? Rather than can you build it or would anybody care? Does that make sense? That's a long answer to a question you didn't even ask. All right. Next question.
So it sounds like we've got a question here.
Yeah, so here's my stupid idea. You know, I'm very much fond of your theory. I think you accomplished what others couldn't do. You took the art of entrepreneurship and transformed it into the science. So now
into a practice, yeah.
Quoting Steve Blank, and you say, okay, I'm doing my startup using Steve Blank's 4 steps to customer development and all of that. But here's what I learned in my country. Too often, too late, people come to your book because they were not trained as engineers, you know, while they are at the universities. And I'm okay with the MBA students reading your books, but I'm not okay with engineers not knowing the science of entrepreneurship. And my stupid idea is that your course should be taught in engineering classes.
Yes, it is. Here in the States. It's taught at Stanford. It is the entrepreneurship class at Stanford Engineering School. Yes. Oh, in fact, you should know, even when I teach it in business schools, it's the only class in a good number of these schools that I have forced them to, at least half the teams have to be engineers. And minimum, because MBAs have ideas, but they don't really have any useful ideas. For me, the most interesting startups are the ones driven by technology ideas, because that's what Silicon Valley is about. So that's how I teach it at Stanford. That's how I teach it for the National Science Foundation. That's how I teach it at Caltech in Southern California. I only teach in business schools at Columbia and Berkeley. So yes, this is, I believe the best ideas come from technologists. Because then they're defensible, right? Business school ideas are, you know, speed and execution, but technology ideas are kind of interesting.
But do you have any plans to go back to your motherland, Russia?
Actually, I was in Russia. I was in Russia a year and a half ago. It was for the first time ever. It was a very interesting experience. I found out that the name Blank is a Ukrainian name. I thought it was changed at Ellis Island when my parents came in, and actually discovered that it was Eastern Poland and then became the Western Ukraine, and then I had some relatives I didn't want to know about, actually. But the answer is yes, and in fact, somebody is now translating my book into Russian, and it should be done, and I think some other people have volunteered to translate the Lean Launchpad lectures on Udacity into Russian as well. And if anybody's interested, I'm happy to put you with my business partner, Bob Dorff, who's...
Bob Dorff is very active. He
goes to Skolkovo.
He has the program Startup Academy with Skolkovo.
Yeah, so Bob is my co-author in the book, lives in New York, Connecticut, and spends a lot of time in Russia. Though you could... In fact, he was just in Kiev. Right? Do they have more than 100 million people? Yes, Russia, Ukraine, you know, old Soviet Union. Do they have cultural, regulatory, or language barriers? Yes, Russia, Soviet Union, EU, Brazil, China, etc. So one could say, gee, you know, I don't need them to go global at first, I need them to win here. That is a business strategy decision. You know, if I'm sitting in Estonia and thinking I'm going to take the Estonian and Baltic market, that's obviously not a large enough business. I need to go global from day one. The second thing I would advise, and I think all of you have traveled enough to see this, if you're going to hand somebody a check for, you know, more than 100 grand, I would make it $105,000 and insist that they come out here for a week, at least. They need to understand, if they haven't been here, living here, whatever, yes, you could do web and mobile via the, but until you kind of go, oh, I get it, these people are insane. You know, and I'm competing with people who don't sleep, right? Which, by the way, is another big idea. So, I don't know the cultures in each one of your countries, but the thing that used to make me angry is seeing an accelerator and I look at the parking lot at 5:30 and it's empty. Like, what are you thinking? You're competing with people who are sleeping under their desks. You're only working half time. Oh, I'm working 40 hours a week. That's my point. You're working half time. So getting people out here to understand the culture they're competing with, and also selling to, etc. Not just tourism, but have them sit into, various incubators and accelerators and get a feel of the culture. And also, if they're trying to get the U.S. mass market, to also get them to understand that the U.S. is not the coasts. While there's a big chunk of our population, the middle of the country is sometimes like a second world country. It's not like as bad as some other places, but our urban areas are not indicative of the entire country. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Yes?
Follow up on your first question about the team. You said how important it is to have an A team. What does it really mean, an A team? Or how do you spot?
That's the question. It's like, what's your definition of a beautiful woman? or man? I mean, it really depends. Are you an investor?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that depends on what you believe is your definition of what's a winning team to make you a ton of money. So, you might want to share stories with other investors who tend to have better DNA than me, but if I had to go through my list, it's, agile, resilient, tenacious, visionary, passionate, curious. I mean, the whole list of and then we could finally get into, do they have any skill in the domain, or are they domain experts, etc. But a bunch of it is, they're crazy people.
What about coachable?
I'm sorry?
Coachable.
Steve Jobs was never coachable. So you have to decide. So those are what I call, and by the way, that category, I've seen a couple of them, and I made the mistake of actually not only investing them in when I used to sit on boards, but trying to sit on their boards. I now have a rule that I call them hold your nose, close your eyes, and give them money investments. Where you kind of go, here, take $100,000. I don't want to, and you don't want anybody you like working there. But they're crazy. So there is some sub-segment I've seen who are offensive, who are nasty, who are crazy, and most of them, that's it. But the others are, but who are also actually will make something happen. And you decide whether you want to invest in it. And Larry Ellison fits that mode, Jobs fit that mode. Gates was better than that, though still a screamer. I mean, you go down through your, you go down through your list of, but for me, the ability to move quickly, the ability to be curious about lots of things, resilient, because they will be knocked, you don't know what entrepreneurship is till you get punched in the face. Then you understand what entrepreneurship is, and then you decide whether you still want to be in this business, and whether you get up and how quickly you get up from failure. Those are the kinds of things that I tend to look for, but how much can you see in a couple meetings? That's up to your pattern recognition skills. And that, by the way, that's another thing I tend to look for, is are they good at patterns? Can they see things that they go, wait a minute, this just looks like this one, And then, I tend to now ask them, do they come from dysfunctional families? Because in Silicon Valley, that tends out to be the dominant CEO type who are founders. People who come from dysfunctional families, whether they were physically or emotionally abusive, who are the survivors, tend to have survived because they know how to shut down everything but what's important. So they know how to operate in immense chaos and focus on what's important. And therefore they're not rattled about the things that, if you grew up in a normal household, and someone else is going, really, no one got shot today? Great, okay, we're doing cool. I remember figuring out this pattern and telling it to one of my mentors, who was a VC, a woman named Catherine Gould. And she listened to me. I said, Catherine, look what I figured out. It's this. And I used to ask my students and get a really interesting answer. She looked at me for a minute. She said, Steve, why do you think I funded you? And then I started laughing. She said, look at my portfolio. I picked these people on purpose. And the other thing she added is, unconsciously, you guys also have a lot to prove. And you'll do anything to prove it. And I never even thought about it. I realized she was right. It's not a requirement, but I'm going to suggest that people who've been through enormous stress or travails to get where they are, and have done well putting it together. The only bad news is for investors is when things become repeatable and executable, they throw hand grenades into their own company. That is, they want the chaos to continue. And it explains a lot of the behavior of, no, we're supposed to be celebrating. Why are they creating more chaos? Because it's the only mode they're comfortable in. And that transition is usually most difficult with those types of entrepreneurs.
Steve, that was a fabulous blog post that you wrote, and I've shared it for many years on this particular subject.
Is that interesting?
And I was in Europe at the time, so not in the Valley. And I guess my question about that article and what you just said is, what do you do then about educating entrepreneurs? It really, and I totally believe what you say because I could see it in myself to start with and I could see it in other entrepreneurs. How do you then grow that? If there has to be this sort of seed.
So you raise a much bigger issue, and I'll put it in context.
Okay.
So here's the other discovery besides the type, is that, again, how many of you are investors? There's a secret memo you guys write to each other that you never tell entrepreneurs, and it goes like this. And the secret memo from investors to entrepreneurs is, when you succeed, the odds are we're going to fire you, but take our money anyway. And here's how it works. Startups, I've talked about, are searching for a business model. Large companies execute business models. But you just don't go from startup to execute. There's a phase in the middle, and it's the secret memo phase. It's called how we build. And what happens is the entrepreneurs running around crazy, and if you're a typical Silicon Valley investor, you sit on 8 to 12 boards, and you might meet with your company every 6 weeks, and you're looking up their name in their parking lot, you know, because you don't even remember the company. It's just another one, you know, crazy entrepreneur, and they kind of remember you because you're the only VC they're meeting. And it goes like this for a while until one day they come in really excited. I have found a repeatable and scalable model. Look at our numbers. And they thinking the next thing you're going to do is pin a medal right on their chest, right there. I mean, they were thinking that you brought that medal. But instead, if you're the investor and there's another investor, you look at each other with what I call the secret VC look. Because then you start staring at the entrepreneur. And you start looking at her. It's making her look very uncomfortable. What are you deciding right then? What are you deciding as an investor? Yeah, why? Because now all of a sudden, you're looking, you don't see like another entrepreneur, you see a big dollar sign. It's a liquidity event, potentially, and now all they could do is screw it up because it's an execution problem. You didn't hire them for execution. Now you're thinking about, who's on my operating exec list that I could go bring in so this founder doesn't screw up my deal? And by the way, not every VC thinks like that, but when I've gone around the Valley, 70% of entrepreneurs get blown out exactly then. Why? Because we never bothered to tell entrepreneurs on day one the entire process. And when I asked my VC friends, why don't you do that? They looked at me again like I was stupid. Are you saying we should tell entrepreneurs we're going to fire them when they succeed? We'd be the only people not doing deals in Silicon Valley. So this becomes a much larger problem of educating entrepreneurs about the fact that we've hired them actually to do one thing, which we never had the language before, but as investors you kind of knew it. We're hiring them to be the crazy people to search for the business model. Fly 24/7, gee, get on the plane, go over here, gee, how come you're not in the States, go back to Russia, go over here. Great, call me when you made me money. Right? It's essentially, well, oh, you made me money, great, you're fired. That's the model. We just don't say that, and nor do we say, and let us tell you the skills over time, that if you decide you want to be an execution exec, that you need to get. We never tell them that there's a different set of skills. And it took me 6 startups to realize, you know what, I really was great at search and I was great at half of build. But when I really kind of got my ego away from it, there's no way I wanted to be the CEO of 10,000 people. I actually wanted to own as much as I could of the one that some other idiot is taking public, which I did. I resigned the day before our S1, our IPO, became effective in New York. With an $8 billion market cap. Thank you very much. We hired the chief operating officer at KPMG, and he took the damn thing public. So to answer your question, it's a bigger question about what's the responsibility and do you care about, you know, coaching entrepreneurs who you are using for a goal, which is to, you know, enhance the value of your portfolio to some liquidity event. And right now, venture capitalists historically been mercenary and said it's not our responsibility at all. But that's why you hear entrepreneurs telling these horror stories of the VC stole my company and gave it to a stupid suit. It's why, you know, Apple hired Scully and fired Jobs. It's not understanding that, in fact, when you get rid completely of the entrepreneur, you've just fired the entrepreneurial DNA, and you better pray you're going to have a soon liquidity event, because at least in the technology business, that cycle of innovation needs to repeat itself often. You just fired those creative people. Instead of saying, let me explain the new role you could have, and yes, you could be creative because we're going to need you, you know, in another 9 to 18 months. Oops, we got rid of all those guys. Why are we getting our ass kicked the year after we went public? Because we don't have any more innovation. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. And it is true that there's two different types of personalities.
Right, of course.
One that wants to do that startup, and like you, I would be bored.
Right, and worse, the minute you're hiring a world-class operating exec, if you didn't train them, they also don't know and understand the value of the entrepreneur. In fact, I remember bringing in the head of the KPMG, whose first comment was, boy, are things disorganized. Excuse me, stupid. We went from 0 to $125 million in a year and a half, and the only thing you can tell me is how fucking disorganized this place looks like? What do you think? And in hindsight, after 15 years, of course it was. He was absolutely right. And from his point of view, what a mess. You know what? And from my point of view, we hired this guy to tell me that the furniture wasn't like in the right. But in fact, he brought process and procedures and scale in a way I never could and had that experience. And so we really don't teach that end-to-end model, because as investors, you know, what the hell do you care? I mean, on one level, the Valley's been like that. My business model as an investor, putting your hat on, is for liquidity for my investors. You know, if I got it this way, who cares about long-term company building? I'm not being incented to build long-term companies. I'm being incented to take liquidity out of these things. Does that make sense? Or
yes, but it would serve everyone.
I don't know. You guys should have that discussion. But in spite of you guys, I mean you guys as investors, I'm being the guy who's being transparent now, telling entrepreneurs that, hey, you're focused on this piece, congratulations, but it's a temporary organization. Exactly. It's temporary. Yeah. Ooh, you know, you either grow up or you die, and when you grow up, you're not going to see the promised land. The odds are. So you better own as much as you can on day one, because you ain't going to be here. Does this help? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with this, as long as all the participants, and I think that's the problem is, you know, it's an asymmetric information game. I mean, historically, VCs have said, well, that's why we sit on the board, because the entrepreneurs have more information than we do, and it's asymmetric. I'll call bullshit from the other side. No, I think it's asymmetric from the other side. You're going to kill me, and you haven't told me that. I think that's even more asymmetry. Does that make sense? Nothing wrong with it. It's just a process that I think, once you understand the end-to-end process, you ought to figure out, are there entrepreneurs in your portfolio that, if given the proper education, could actually end up managing the company to greater scale than bringing a founder? Look at who runs or ran the world's largest technology companies. Bill Gates. What did he do? He hired and fired 4, maybe 5 presidents. Hired them, sucked them dry, fired them. Hired them, sucked them dry, fired them. Larry Ellison at Oracle. Company scaled, almost lost control of his entire company, had to bring in Ray Lane, who's now a general partner at Kleiner. Had Ray there for 7 years, sucked him dry, fired him. Okay? Steve Jobs, you know, classic. Built the company, hired a world-class scale guy, turned around and fired him. And now if you listen to John Scully, it was the worst mistake Scully made in his life. And luckily for Apple, you know, Jobs came back and resurrected the company. You know, Reed Hastings, you know, go through the whole list of who's running, you know, the largest technology companies. Yet, the reality is most of those founders get blown out. So the question is there a way to kind of educate them? I don't think there would have been any way to educate Steve Jobs at Apple. Too much of an ego. I don't think there would have been any way to educate me in my first 4 startups, maybe even 5. Too stupid, too pig-headed. After a while, because I'm a slow learner, I eventually, you know, like figured it out, go, oh, this is what's going on. Got it, there's a pattern here. Question?
Well, I was just about to make a comment, but you succeeded in educating others with other, you know, customer development.
How about that?
I mean, and America is great at talking about failures and all that experience.
Yes.
So how about you doing something
I'm explaining it now.
If you do it, then it will be easy.
Great. Do you think they would be worthwhile?
They will be.
And another book, I'm happy to write another blog post. No, send me an email and tell me what you would like in a blog post for an investor, and I'm happy to do it. No, you know, in fact, it's the reason I do these conversations is I learn a lot from these questions, particularly talking to investors, is that, you know, because it forces me to think about, well, what's it look like from this side? And, you know, wait a minute, why don't you write the secret memo? And then, you know, oh, and then I started asking my friend, Steve, are you crazy? We'll put us out of business if we did that. It's about deal flow, for God's sake. We want to optimize deal flow, not minimize it, and we can't be the only guys not talking about this bad news.
And the other thing is to really, all the talk now is about the fact that the venture capital model is broken and needs fixing, and I think this could be one piece of that.
Could be one piece.
More transparency and a different way of moving forward.
Right. Yes.
How do you see the venture capital angel space change in the next 2-3 years? Because I look at it as we on a movement of a lot more women investors, especially on the angel side of things. Crowdfunding, job act coming into play.
It's exciting.
Everything. And it's going to change. I see it changing the mindset of entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
They get money faster while doing less. And also, it's going to make it different platforms can make it easier for investors to less money, but still have less risk. But it's going to change the entire ecosystem.
Yep. So the answer is yes. No, and if I knew, you know, how things were changed, so I usually get two questions. You just asked one of them. The other one is, so what are the hot areas to invest in? And no, and to answer to both, if I knew answers to either one, I'd be running a hedge fund. But not. I'm retired. So, but clearly the ecosystem is changing. I happen to be a skeptic on Kickstarter. I mean, the fact that stupid people want to give out money to other stupid people, you know, with no control at all. I mean, they think they're buying a product, and actually, you know, it's a Ponzi scheme. So as far as I'm concerned, eventually, I think the model will work when there's some more controls. But yeah, if entrepreneurs want to get some money from that, I just think we're in a phase now that the cost of starting a business is so low. Is that people who do web apps kind of are confusing themselves and investors. And the first question to ask to anybody is this a hobby? Is this a small business when you're done? Or is this a scalable startup? And you know, if it's a hobby that you can make $100 grand a year, congratulations, Kickstarter is exactly great. You know, is this small business? You want to feed your family? Great, wonderful. That's not what I'm looking for as an investor. Or you could decide, no, that is the kind of returns I want. Or the next one is, which I call a viable startup, is this something that you want to flip for somewhere between you know, $1 million and $10 million bucks? And okay, I got to decide whether I want to invest in those. Or is it a scalable startup that, you know, these are founders who have crazy look in their eyes who are going $1 billion or bust. Those are the things that I tend to look for. What, you know, you ought to decide is what is it we're investing in, and what are we communicating, you know, in terms of taxonomy of what there is out there to our potential, you know, entrepreneurs. The second thing is, I suggested in this whole chaos, I think you as investors, it's not that hard to say, listen, we'll talk to anybody, but conversations go a lot better when we're talking in a common language of, tell me about your canvas, tell me about, you know, how you've tested those hypotheses, and tell me what you've built actually. Well, now in fact, that's not a barrier to anybody, to any investor, just asking that. In fact, people will think you kind of get it. Because now, in fact, when you actually say, tell me what your initial canvas looked like, and tell me the steps that you've gotten to where you are. Oh, you just have one canvas, you haven't done customer development? Do I know you, or are you famous? No? Well, come back when you are. Or you can set whatever other criteria you want, but now that's not even a negative, that's actually a positive. Holy cow, there's a VC who gets it in, you know, in Ukraine or wherever you are. What a great idea. Does that help? Or?
There is disconnect between the search and the execution.
Yes.
And we are looking for both search and execution as an investor. Kind of, because you can coach people how to do customer development, they will do it,
yes,
but they will not be able to execute it. So kind of this is the disconnect from like people that know how to do customer.
Right, and that's part of the team building as well. Is you know, do you have on your list of people, you know, the guys or women you bring in when this thing gets to this scale? You know, we know a junior operating executive who's great to take from 100,000 to, you know, $5 million. And gee, if it gets past that, we know even more senior people. I mean, right? Different teams have different capabilities, right?
And more co-founders in these teams. Kind of
possibly, or a later, you know, or a later one. It's basically what's your philosophy and what's their philosophy and how does it work best for you? Yes. You know, part of my skill was I loved the search, but I was pretty good at some of the execution. I kind of enjoyed building the transition of, okay, we're crazy, great, boom, sales department, marketing department, whatever process, but I hated to scale them. That is, at Epiphany, I was the one who sold the first 5 or 10 $5 million deals. And I was the one who found the repeatable and scalable sales process. But then we hired Karen Richardson from Netscape, who was awesome at, you know, hiring salespeople. And in fact, 4 years later, she was still using the sales process we had discovered. But boy, I could never have done what Karen had done. And by the way, Karen would probably admit she'd never do what I would do. She now sits on the board of British Telecom. And we still, thank God we still like each other. But it was that kind of relationship where she appreciated my value, and I clearly, by my 8th startup, appreciated hers. Other questions?
Well, what do you think about kind of outsourcing resources used for the initial execution, kind of validating of the...
Yeah, I've seen startups do that well, and I've seen it do it bad. It depends on, as...
You know, they might execute it well, but then you as an investor, you know, you don't get this execution or like to scale.
Right, so there's a hard transition. So what they've done is they've validated the prototype, but they haven't validated building the company, right? And so that's a decision you make on both resources, team. Do they have experience doing that? Do you have experience coaching? That's a great value add that you could do, coaching, managing them. But I have to tell you, I've now, and it's very funny you said this, rules for basically investors, because I now get beat up by my VC friends a lot too, because they're reading the same blog as I'm actually writing for the entrepreneur. Actually, have any of you seen my blog at all, steveblank.com? I actually started writing it for my kids because 3 years ago, the youngest one graduated high school, and they had no idea that their father actually worked for a living at one point in his life. So I started telling stories of what Dad actually did. In fact, I will tell you a funny story. My daughter is now a junior in college this summer. She's an economics major, but decided to, gee, Dad, I'd like to work in New York City this summer. Great, Sarah, what would you like to do? She said, well, some of my friends are talking about something called the startup. Do you know anything about startup? I was like, holding the phone. I went, Sarah, what? She said, well, you teach, right? And, you know, and I realized at 20 years old, you don't pay attention. We never made a big deal. I mean, I've always told my kids in this family, you do whatever, you know, you're passionate about, and you'll find your passion. But you're not living here, but you need to find your own passion. And I said, well, Sarah, I know a little about it. Well, Dad, do you know anybody who might be interested in interviewing me? I said, well, maybe we could find a couple. So, you know, she gets a couple of interviews, and what I didn't realize is nowadays kids get interviewed for summer jobs in the United States via Skype. You know, who thought? And so she didn't have to drive to New York City. And then she calls me back. She said, Dad, in 3 of those interviews, they said, are you related to Steve Blank? She said, how would they? I said, Sarah, it's time for a facts of life discussion. And so I had to describe to her, you know, the facts of life. And it was actually it was harder than the sex discussion, actually. I said, you know, you might encounter some people in New York who have heard of your father. Oh, is that good? I said, yeah, in this case it is. I don't think I fired any of those people in my career. But in any case, so I'm actually going to answer your discussion. I now got some numbers from actually 2 VCs I kind of respect, Andy Ratcliffe, who used to be at Benchmark, and John Fiber at Moore Davis. And they both said, after 20 years of business, what we've now figured out is that the selection on day 1 of the deal is 20x more important than the coaching you're going to give them. He said, coaching, you know what, you like to think you're a great board member, that could move the needle 2 to 5x. But boy, picking the right one on day one, and this is back to the Airbnb thing, you know, that's a 10, 20x decision. And I just thought that was very interesting because you like to think you're adding value as a coach and mentor and whatever. And he said, it's not like you don't add any. But boy, the difference between picking the right deals and the right teams and the right whatever on day one is a lot more important. And I just thought that, and I'll throw that out as what the hell do I know, but it's kind of an interesting thing to ponder.